You watch a well-known pro sit down in a soft game. They do not play more hands. They do not outbet everyone at the table. Instead, you notice something quieter. Every decision looks routine, but underneath it, you start to notice a set of principles that seem to shape every action. The usual tricks and flashy bluffs are missing. What you are really watching is a disciplined system for generating consistent expected value, hand after hand, with very little wasted motion. That is what this video is about. We're breaking down the core principles behind profitable cash game poker. We'll get into the subtle edge that comes from knowing when not to push thin value. We'll look at the quiet discipline behind seat selection. And we'll look at how real pros let table dynamics guide their aggression. Each of these is a pressure point that most players overlook. When you line them up, the small edges turn into real profit. By the end of this, you'll have a clearer picture of how strong cash players tend to keep the game simple, sharp, and consistently profitable. So get comfortable and settle in. Number 1. Identifying tight aggressive players. You don't need a tracking tool to spot the player who's likely to give you the most trouble at the table. Watching a few orbits is usually enough. A tight aggressive player enters pots with a narrow range of hands. That means premium pairs, strong Broadway hands, and suited connectors that tend to play well across a variety of situations. In a full ring game, that often means they're voluntarily putting money in somewhere around 10 to 20% of hands. They're not splashing around. When they do show up in a pot, they've already filtered out a lot of the junk. What makes this style genuinely difficult to play against is what happens after they enter. Once they're in, they don't slow down. Rather than call, they bet and raise. Pressure is applied on boards that favor their range. Continuation betting occurs at a high rate, often somewhere around 60 to 80% of the time. Their post-flop aggression isn't random. They tend to pick spots where their hand or their range has an advantage. At the table, the patterns are readable once you know what to look for. A tight aggressive player opens more often than they limp. They 3-bet from early position only with strong holdings. From late position, they 3-bet more liberally. They fold a lot of hands before the flop. When they do enter, they're usually the one raising. After a couple of orbits, you'll notice they've played maybe one hand in 5 or 6. That hand came in with a raise. When you're deciding how to adjust, the first thing to recognize is where their range is weakest. Tight aggressive players are most vulnerable when they're not the aggressor. When they call before the flop instead of raising, their range is narrower and weaker than usual. The same is true when they check the flop instead of betting. Those tend to be the spots where applying pressure makes more sense. At the same time, tightening your own game reduces the unforced errors they can capitalize on. Playing marginal hands out of position against a player with a strong range and a high aggression frequency is a spot worth avoiding. You don't need to outplay them in every pot. You need to pick the right pots. Number 2. Exploiting loose passive opponents. You'll run into this player type at most live tables. They're in a lot of pots. They call frequently. They almost never raise. When the action gets back to them, they just call again. That's the loose passive player. Some players call this type a calling station. This player type tends to have a wide range because they play too many starting hands. It's also weak because they limp in, rather than build pots with aggression. They're not trying to pressure you. They're just trying to see cards. What makes them exploitable is the predictability of that pattern. When someone rarely raises, you know where you stand when they do. And when someone calls on multiple streets with marginal holdings, you can charge that calling range for it repeatedly. Passive defense doesn't protect them. It just costs them chips slowly. Post-flop is where the edge tends to show up. Against a loose passive player, your value hands generally want to bet all three streets. These players tend to call with second pair, with weak draws, with hands that have very little chance of winning at Showdown. That's the kind of situation where checking or controlling the pot size unnecessarily tends to leave value behind. Bet your strong hands. Then bet them again. Board texture still matters here. On boards that favor your range and leave them with a lot of marginal or drawing hands, your continuation bets are more likely to work well. They'll mostly call or fold. They won't often check raise. That's worth tracking. If a loose passive player does raise you on the flop or later, that's a meaningful signal. They're not doing it light. It's usually worth treating that raise as a strong hand. Semi-bluffs can still have some value against these players when you hold a strong draw, because the draw itself can win at Showdown even when they call. But pure bluffs on air are generally less effective. That wide calling range tends to reduce your fold equity on most textures, which makes bluffing without equity a difficult spot to profit from. Where pot control does matter is when your hand is marginal or vulnerable. Out of position with a medium-strength hand on a coordinated board, checking to keep the pot smaller can make sense. Bloating the pot against a range that could have you beat is a risk worth avoiding. Careful bet sizing and well-timed checks can help you extract thin value without overcommitting when you don't have a clear advantage. Number 3. Manipulating loose aggressive players. They're not hard to recognize once you've seen the pattern a few times. They play somewhere around 25 to 40% of hands pre-flop, sometimes more. They're not waiting for premium cards. They raise from late position. They 3-bet with a wide range. They fire continuation bets on the flop, whether they connected or not. The defining feature isn't just the volume of hands they enter. It's that they play those hands aggressively. Checking and calling aren't their default moves. Betting and raising are. That tendency is what makes them exploitable. When you're holding a strong hand against this type of player, your first instinct might be to raise right away and build the pot yourself. Sometimes that's the right move. But against a player who's likely to bet multiple streets anyway, you often don't need to do that work. You can let them do it for you. Slow playing a hand with real value and calling rather than raising is a legitimate trapping approach. The goal is to keep them engaged. If you raise too early, you might end the action before the pot gets large. If you call and let them barrel, the pot grows on their initiative. You're the one holding the strong hand at the end. Position makes this easier to execute. When you're in position, you can call their bets on each street and control how the hand develops. Out of position, check calling becomes your primary tool. It keeps the pot manageable. It lets you respond to their aggression rather than trying to outmaneuver it. The harder decision is when you're not holding a monster. Sometimes they'll put you in spots where you have a decent hand but not a great one, and they're applying pressure. Their betting patterns are your main source of information here. If they're known to barrel multiple streets with a wide range, calling down with solid holdings can be profitable. You don't need to re-raise to extract value. Calling is often enough to get there. Bluffing into this type of player tends to be a losing approach. They call and raise often enough that bluffs rarely work at a frequency that makes them worthwhile. The better tendency is to let their aggression create the value. Then you're there to collect it. Number 4. Decoding the rock player. You can spot this player type within the first few orbits at a table. They sit quietly, fold hand after hand, and rarely get involved. If they choose to play, something has usually changed in front of them. Their cards are strong. They know it. This is the rock. The defining trait is extreme selectivity. They wait for premium starting hands like big pocket pairs or ace-king suited. They fold almost everything else. Their voluntary pot entry rate is very low compared to the rest of the table. Their pre-flop raising frequency tends to be low as well. They're not looking for action. They're looking for spots where they feel confident they have the best of it. What makes this player type readable is the consistency. A rock's behavior doesn't shift much from session to session. They're not adjusting to the table dynamic or mixing in speculative hands to stay unpredictable. The hands they play stay narrow. Their actions stay cautious. If they raise pre-flop, it tends to represent a short list of strong holdings. When they 3-bet, that list gets shorter still. Post-flop play tells you a lot as well. A rock tends to slow down on boards that don't connect cleanly with premium hands. They'll check or fold more often than you'd expect. Showing aggression on the flop or turn is meaningful. It tends to mean the board connected well with their starting hand selection. Most experienced players at the table will recognize that signal and give them credit. That predictability is where the opportunity lives. Because you can often estimate what a rock holds with reasonable confidence, you can make decisions that would be harder against a looser player. You can steal their blinds from late position more often than you'd steal from someone else. They're folding a wide range of hands to a pre-flop raise. They're generally not inclined to defend without something real. Those small pots add up over a session. On dry flops, a continuation bet will frequently take the pot. The rock needs a reason to continue. A board that doesn't connect with their narrow range rarely gives them one. If they push back, folding is usually a reasonable response. Their aggression tends to carry weight because it's rare. Number 5. Understanding the maniac's mindset. Some players sit down and immediately make the table feel different. They'll raise before the flop with hands most people wouldn't look at twice. Betting the flop, the turn, the river, regardless of what came out, seems to be their strategy. They don't seem to be waiting for anything. That's the maniac. The maniac is a loose, aggressive player who enters far more pots than average and uses large bets and raises across a very wide range of hands. This aggression isn't connected to hand strength the way it is for most players. They'll barrel 3 streets with a weak holding just as readily as they would with a strong one. The unpredictability is what makes them feel chaotic, but it also makes them readable in a different way. After a few orbits, you'll notice the pattern. They're not really unpredictable. They're just consistently aggressive. One thing to understand early is that bluffing a maniac tends not to work well. They call too wide. The frequency with which they call with weak hands is much higher than a typical player's, so running a bluff against them is generally a low return move. The better adjustment is to tighten your starting hand selection and wait for strong holdings. When you have a real hand, the maniac will frequently build the pot for you. Their overbets and loose calls put chips in the middle in spots where you're likely a significant favorite. Position matters a lot here. If you can sit to the immediate left of the maniac, you'll act after them in most hands. That lets you see their raise before you decide to enter the pot. It gives you more control over whether you're involved and how much you're investing. The other piece is pot control. With a marginal hand, You don't want to be calling multiple large bets across 3 streets. That's one way stacks get transferred through a maniac's aggression. When you're not sure where you stand, keeping the pot small protects you from the spots where their wide range happens to connect. Check calling instead of check raising is one way to manage that. It lets them keep bluffing without letting the pot grow beyond what your hand can justify. The maniac tends to make mistakes at a high rate. Your job is to be in a position to collect on those mistakes without taking on unnecessary risk along the way. Number 6. Psychological warfare, inducing tilt. Tilt starts as a feeling. Something goes wrong at the table. A bad beat, a cooler, a string of missed draws. Instead of resetting, a player lets that feeling start making decisions for them. That shift is what tilt is. It's not just frustration. It's when emotions take the wheel and rational thinking steps back. The player is still acting like they're making choices, but those choices are being driven by urgency, anger, or a need to get even rather than by sound reasoning. In a cash game, that matters a lot. A tilting player tends to loosen up their hand selection. They'll size their bets erratically. They'll chase outcomes instead of thinking through each spot. Their variance goes up and their edge goes down. For you, that's opportunity. When someone at your table is no longer playing their game, they're playing their feelings. And feelings tend to make mistakes. The first step in using this is learning to see it. Watch for pattern disruption. A player who's been tight and quiet suddenly starts playing a lot more hands. They might raise more often. They might call in spots where they'd normally fold. That kind of departure from their baseline is a signal. Physical cues can back it up too. Visible tension in the face. Restless movement. Changes in posture. These aren't guarantees, but they're worth tracking. The players who tend to be most vulnerable to tilt are often the ones who react strongly to short-term variance. If someone's complaining about luck or grumbling after pots, pay attention. That kind of open frustration tells you something useful about how they handle pressure. Once you've identified a player who's emotionally off balance, you have options. Sustained and well-timed aggression can keep a frustrated player on edge. You don't need to say a word. Consistent pressure in the right spots adds to their stress. If you do engage verbally, keep it measured. A calm and neutral comment that subtly questions a decision can land harder than anything loud or obvious. Showing a bluff at the right moment can plant doubt. It can amplify whatever frustration is already there. What you're doing throughout all of this is staying composed while they're not. Your calm demeanor isn't just good mental game. It contrasts directly with their state. That contrast can push them further off balance. The gap between your clarity and their noise is where your edge lives. Number 7. Projecting false tells. Observant opponents tend to be collecting information constantly. Every time you breathe differently, shift your weight, or glance somewhere unexpected, someone at the table may be filing that away. The question isn't whether your body is sending signals. It's whether those signals are working for you or against you. A tell is any change in behavior that gives away something about your hand. Sitting up straighter can read as engagement. Glancing at your chips after the flop often reads as strength. Leaning forward suggests you've connected with the board. Quick calls tend to read as medium strength holdings. And the classic exaggerated sigh or shrug tends to read as strong to experienced players, because they've come to expect that performed weakness often signals real strength. Those patterns exist because they're genuinely common. Most players don't control their physical reactions, so those reads tend to carry genuine weight over a large enough sample. That's exactly what makes them useful to manufacture. When you hold a strong hand, try leaning back and letting your posture go slack. Double-checking your hole cards is a natural-looking move even when you already know what you have. Shuffle chips slowly, look away after you bet, or let a small sigh escape. All borrow from the physical vocabulary of someone who hasn't connected. You're showing observers what they expect to see from a weaker holding. When you're weak, sitting up, glancing at your stack, and keeping your movements deliberate and calm can project quiet confidence. You're borrowing the physical vocabulary of someone who's connected. The key word in all of this is subtle. Exaggerated acting tends to read as acting. Natural and quiet adjustments tend to read as real. Controlled breathing and slowed movement can help mask your genuine reactions, so that what opponents see is closer to what you've chosen to show them. None of this works as a one-hand trick. The real leverage comes from repetition. You pair the same behavior with the same category of hand across many hands and many sessions. You use the same patterns in small pots and large ones. You occasionally show down a hand that confirms what opponents think they've been reading. Over time, that consistency can build a story. Opponents may start making decisions based on a signal that you've shaped. That's when a manufactured tell starts to carry real weight. Number 8. Using opponents' tells effectively. A lot of players notice something at the table and act on it right away. That tends to be where the trouble starts. A tell is only useful when you understand what it actually is and where it comes from. The basic definition is straightforward. A tell is generally understood as an unintentional signal that leaks information about a player's hand strength or their confidence in a decision. The key word is unintentional. When something happens without the player meaning for it to happen, that's what you're looking for. Changes in breathing are one example. A shift in posture is another. A sudden grip on chips, or a moment of hesitation before speaking can also fall into this category. These responses are involuntary. The player isn't choosing to do them. Then there's the other category. Some players deliberately perform behaviors to mislead you. Exaggerated confidence is one version of this. Fake disinterest is another. Some players will even produce intentionally shaky hands. These behaviors are manufactured. They're designed to look like genuine tells, and sometimes they're convincing. Your job is to tell the difference. That takes time. The way you start separating real from fake is by establishing a baseline. Spend the first part of a session just watching. Observe how a player sits when they're folding pre-flop. Pay attention to how they talk when there's nothing at stake. Take note of how quickly they act when the pot is small. That's their neutral state. A tell only means something when it's a clear departure from that baseline. One facial expression, one movement, one moment of hesitation means almost nothing on its own. You need to compare it to what that specific player normally does. Some behaviors stay genuinely ambiguous no matter how much you watch. A player covering their mouth could be nervous or could be thinking. Someone who suddenly relaxes might have a strong hand or might be acting. These inconclusive tells belong in a third category. You don't ignore them. You don't fully trust them either. You hold them until you have more information. Physical tells tend to cluster around tension. White knuckles are common. A clenched jaw is another signal. Leaning forward or turning toward the pot can also appear. These are stress responses. They're harder to fake consistently over a long session because sustaining them requires real effort. Verbal tells are also worth tracking. Stuttered speech or unusual word choices can both carry information. They're generally easier to manufacture than physical tells, so weigh them accordingly. The goal at this stage is observation and cataloging. You're building a reference. You're not drawing conclusions yet. Number 9. Dynamic bluffing adjustments. You can't use the same bluff approach against every player at the table. Some players fold too much. Some call down with almost anything. Treating them the same way tends to cost you chips you didn't need to risk. Start by watching how your opponents actually play. Look at their betting patterns. In live games, you can also pick up on physical tells. In online games, you'll often have access to stats that track how often someone enters a pot and how often they raise. A player who enters a lot of pots but rarely raises is telling you something important. That gap usually points to a passive, call-heavy player. Bluffing that player frequently isn't going to work well. You'll get called down and lose chips you didn't need to risk. Against players who fold too much, you can increase your frequency of outright bluffs. Against players who call too much, shift towards semi-bluffs. Semi-bluffs let you keep pressure on while still having outs if you get called. When you're up against a calling station, you want to be betting your strong hands for value and stepping back from bluffs with no backup. Board texture matters just as much as the player sitting across from you. A dry, disconnected board doesn't give your opponent many strong hands or draws to work with. That kind of board tends to favor the pre-flop aggressor. Continuation bets and bluffs work better there because your story is easier to tell and harder to dispute. Wet, coordinated boards are a different situation. When the flop has several connected cards or flush draw possibilities, your opponent's range connects with it more often. Bluffs on those boards tend to run into more resistance. If you're going to apply pressure on a wet board, you want hands with real equity behind them. Count your outs and make sure the bluff has some backup if you get called. As the session goes on, the game changes around you. Stack sizes shift. Some players tighten up after losing a big pot. Others loosen up when they're running well. Your bluffing approach needs to move with those changes. If you bluff at the same frequency with the same sizing on the same types of boards all session, attentive opponents are likely to start picking up on the pattern. Mixing your lines and adjusting your sizing keeps your range hard to read. Responding to what's actually happening at the table is what makes that possible. Number 10. Semi-bluffing for maximum impact. When you bet or raise with a drawing hand, you're not purely bluffing. You still have a real chance to make the best hand by the river. That's what separates a semi-bluff from a pure bluff. A pure bluff has almost no equity behind it. If your opponent calls, you're most likely losing. A semi-bluff gives you two ways to win the pot. Your opponent folds and you take it down right there. Or your opponent calls, you hit your draw, and you win anyway. The hands that work best here are strong draws. Flush draws and open-ended straight draws carry enough outs that even when you don't get a fold, you're still in the hand with real equity against a typical one-pair holding. Weaker draws like gut shots have fewer outs. They can still serve a purpose in your bluffing range when the chance your opponent folds is available. On their own, they don't have much showdown value, so applying pressure is often the better use of them. The likelihood they give up the pot is the core of why semi-bluffing works. It's the probability that your opponent folds to your bet. When that probability is meaningful, Your semi-bluff doesn't need to complete to be profitable. The pot you win immediately covers a lot of ground. Board texture plays a big role here. Coordinated boards tend to generate more folds. They credibly represent strong-made hands, and opponents holding marginal holdings often can't continue against that pressure. Betting into a range that's already capped or weak increases the chance your opponent can't continue. Sizing matters too. Bigger bets put more pressure on marginal hands. The relationship isn't perfectly linear, though. Very large bets can shift how opponents read your range. Position adds another layer. When you act later in the hand, you have more information before deciding to apply pressure. That makes your aggression more precise and harder to read. The balance you're looking for is selective and forceful. Semi-bluffing works best inside a tight and aggressive overall style, not as a constant habit. Opponents who rarely fold push your fold equity close to zero. Against those players, your semi-bluff starts to function more like a straight drawing gamble. Against those players, checking and preserving your equity is often the better line. The decision tends to come back to three core questions. How likely is your opponent to fold? How much equity does your draw carry? And what does committing chips cost you relative to your stack? Number 11. Understanding reverse tells. Some players at the table are performing. They know you're watching, and they're giving you something to see. That's the core of what a reverse tell is. It's a deliberate action designed to send false information. It works by exploiting your instinct to read behavior. A regular tell is usually involuntary. The player doesn't know they're doing it. A reverse tell is the opposite. The player chooses the behavior. They shape it and deliver it with a specific result in mind. They want you to misread their hand strength. They want you to fold when you should call, or call when you should fold. The most common version is acting weak while holding a strong hand. Slumping. Sighing. Hesitating before betting. Making a comment that suggests doubt. All of it crafted. In live games, it tends to show up through body language, timing, and verbal behavior. Online, it tends to show up through bet sizing patterns, deliberate timing changes, or chat. Spotting these takes a baseline. You can't identify a deviation without knowing what normal looks like for that player. Watch how they act in neutral spots. Those are hands where there's no real pressure. That behavior is your reference point. When something shifts, that's when you start asking questions. A single action doesn't tell you much, but pattern recognition is more reliable. If a player tends to act relaxed when they're comfortable and suddenly starts sighing and stalling on a big hand, that shift is worth noting. If they sigh every other hand, it's likely just noise. Context also matters. A reverse tell tends to be more effective against players who are actively watching for tells. An observant player is more likely to act on misleading information. That's exactly what the performer wants. If you know you're being observed, that's worth factoring in. The practical counter is to anchor your decisions in the hand itself. That means range analysis, pot odds, and the betting line so far. Tells are supplementary information. They're not the foundation. When you're uncertain whether a behavior is genuine or manufactured, defaulting to the straightforward read tends to be the safer option. Chasing the deeper level of deception is where composure starts to break down. That's a cost that rarely pays off. Number 12. Exploiting positional awareness. You already know what your cards are. That's the easy part. What most players underestimate is how much the seat you're sitting in shapes every decision you make. Sometimes it matters more than the cards themselves. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, position refers to where you sit relative to the dealer button, and more importantly, the order in which you act on each betting street. The button moves one seat clockwise after every hand, so your position rotates. Sometimes you're first to act. Sometimes you're last. That rotation matters because acting last on a betting street means you've already seen what everyone else has done before you have to commit a single chip. That's the core of positional advantage. When you act after your opponents, you have information they didn't have when they acted. You know whether they checked or bet. You know whether they bet small or large. You know whether they hesitated or moved quickly. You get to respond to a revealed situation. They had to act into an unknown one. That gap in information is real, and it compounds across every street of every hand. The blinds are the clearest example of the structural downside. You post money before the cards are dealt, and then on every post-flop street you act first. You're playing the entire hand without knowing how the pre-flop raiser is going to respond to the board. That's why the blinds are generally the least profitable seats at the table. The positional disadvantage isn't just inconvenient. It's built into the structure. The button is the opposite. You act last on the flop, the turn, and the river every single time. That's why it's widely considered the most advantageous seat in the game. Here's how that plays out when you're constructing your ranges from different seats. Early position, meaning the first few seats to act after the blinds, requires a tighter approach. You're going to act before most of the table on every street. There's no way to tell yet whether someone behind you has a strong hand. It's unclear whether you'll face one opponent or four. Because of that uncertainty, you lean toward premium and strong hands. You're not being timid. You're being precise. The range you build from early position is designed to hold up well in a variety of situations, including ones where you're out of position for the rest of the hand. Middle position allows you to open up a bit. Fewer players are left to act behind you, which reduces the chance of running into a strong 3-bet from a large field. You can start including more speculative hands that have good playability. These are hands that can make strong draws or disguised made hands on favorable boards. You're still not playing as wide as late position, but you're not as restricted as early position either. The key shift is that the risk profile changes as the field narrows. Late position, particularly the cutoff and the button, is where your range can be the widest. By the time it's your turn to act pre-flop, you've already seen how much of the table wants to play. If several players have folded, you're potentially entering the pot against one or two opponents. You'll be in position against them for the whole hand. That combination of a smaller field and positional advantage means hands that would be marginal from early position can become genuinely profitable from the button. This is also where button steals become part of your toolkit. When the action folds to you in late position, raising with a wider range to pick up the blinds is a straightforward application of positional leverage. You're not necessarily relying on card strength. You're working from the fact that the remaining players have shown weakness by folding, and you'll have position if they do call. The post-flop advantages of late position extend beyond just having information. They shape how you manage pot size. When you're in position, you can choose to call and keep the pot manageable, or you can raise and apply pressure. Your opponent has to act first without knowing which of those you're going to do. That uncertainty is a real constraint on how they can play. It limits their options and expands yours. Out of position, you face the opposite problem. If you bet, you don't know whether you'll face a call, a raise, or a fold. If you check, you've given up the initiative. You're reacting to whatever comes next. Multi-way pots from early seats are especially complicated. You're navigating a board while acting first, without knowing how multiple opponents behind you are going to respond. There's a phrase you'll hear often in cash game discussions: position is king. That's not just a slogan. It reflects the structural reality that acting last on each street tends to produce more accurate decisions across a large sample. You tend to make better calls because you have more information. You tend to make better folds for the same reason. You can extract more value from strong hands because you can size your bets after seeing how your opponent has engaged with the board. Those edges are individually small, but they accumulate across sessions. One practical implication worth noting is seat selection. In many live games, having weaker or looser players seated to your right tends to be genuinely valuable. If they act before you, you get to observe their tendencies and respond. If they act after you, you're the one acting blind to their decisions. Chips tend to flow toward the players who act later. Positioning yourself to the left of players you want to exploit isn't just a preference. It's a strategic consideration. Shifting from thinking about your cards first to thinking about your seat first is one of the more meaningful adjustments you can make. Your hand matters. But a strong hand out of position is harder to play than a moderate hand in position. Once you start filtering every pre-flop decision through where you're sitting, the rest of your strategy tends to organize itself around a much more stable foundation. Number 13. Adaptive betting strategies. A lot of players pick a bet size and stick with it. They raise 3 big blinds pre-flop, bet half pot on the flop, and repeat that pattern regardless of who's sitting across from them. That consistency feels disciplined, but it's likely costing them value. Bet sizing isn't a fixed rule. It's a tool you adjust based on what your opponents are doing. When facing a calling station who rarely folds, your standard half-pot continuation bet isn't doing much work. You'll want to size up on the turn and river with your strong hands. That player tends to call regardless of what you bet. For a tight, aggressive opponent who tends to fold to pressure, a smaller bet can accomplish the same goal as a larger one. It also costs you less when you're bluffing. Pre-flop sizing follows the same logic. In a live game with several limpers already in the pot, raising 3 big blinds into that field often isn't enough. You typically go 4 or 5 big blinds to isolate weaker players and charge them a meaningful price to continue. The extra dead money in the pot makes that adjustment worthwhile. Pot odds are the mechanism underneath all of this. When you bet, you're setting the price your opponent has to pay to continue. If the pot is 100 and you bet 100, your opponent needs to call 100 to win 200. That's roughly 33% equity needed to break even on the call. If they're on a draw that completes around 20% of the time, calling is likely a mistake on their part. Your bet size created that mistake. You can also run this in reverse. If you have a strong hand and you want a loose player to call, you can offer them a price that looks attractive. A smaller bet tends to invite action. A larger bet can push away the very players you're hoping to keep in. Exploiting tendencies comes down to observation. Some players fold too often to continuation bets. With them, you can bet more frequently with a wider range. Other players call too often with weak draws. For those players, sizing up tends to make those calls costly. The bet size you choose signals nothing to a player who isn't paying attention. And when facing a player who's predictable, it can help you extract a lot more value. Number 14. Handling multi-way pots. When 3 or more players see a flop together, the math of the situation changes in ways that aren't always obvious. The pot is bigger, which feels good, but the chance that someone has connected strongly with the board goes up with every additional player. That's the core tension you're managing in these spots. Variance is higher in these spots. That's not just a feeling you get from bad results. It's built into the structure of the situation. More players means more hand combinations in play. Your equity edge compresses across the field. A hand like top pair top kicker might hold somewhere around 60 to 70% equity heads up on a dry flop. On a coordinated flop, that number tends to be lower. In a 3 or 4-way pot, that same hand holds a much smaller share. You're still ahead of any single opponent. The field as a whole is a different problem. Fold equity also drops as more players are involved. Wide betting ranges and aggressive bluffing lines tend to work less frequently in those spots. Solvers tend to recommend lower continuation bet frequencies in 3-way spots compared to heads-up. They also favor smaller sizes, often in the range of 1/3 to 1/2 pot, rather than larger bets. Your hand selection has to respond to that reality. One-pair hands lose value faster in multi-way pots because equity gets distributed across more players. Hands like second pair with no redraws tend to be folded at high frequencies against a single bet in 3-way solver outputs. The hands that retain value are ones that can survive raises and still be ahead. Sets, 2-pair, straights, strong flush draws with overcards. Suited connectors and small pairs can become attractive preflop because they tend to be binary in how they connect. They either hit the board hard or they miss cleanly. That makes post-flop decisions more straightforward. Marginal top pair in a crowded pot tends to put you in difficult spots, and the solver tends to treat those hands as checks or low-frequency bets rather than standard value hands. Position amplifies all of this. When you're last to act, you see how multiple players respond before you commit anything. That information lets you control pot size more accurately. You can bet thinner for value when the action in front of you is weak. You can fold marginal hands when the action signals strength. Out of position, the tendency is to check more frequently and concede more often with medium-strength hands. The player on the button in a 3-way pot is working with more data on every street. That advantage tends to grow as the hand develops. Number 15. Adjusting to table image shifts. Your opponents are paying attention. Every time you put chips in the pot, you're giving them information. Every time you fold, you're giving them information. Every time you show a hand at Showdown, you're giving them information. That information shapes how they see you. And how they see you changes how they play against you. That's what table image is. It's the collective read your opponents have built on you based on everything they've observed. It's not fixed. It shifts hand by hand as they collect more data. It's also one of the more important things to track across a session. Opponents tend to sort players into broad categories. Tight or loose describes how often you enter pots. Aggressive or passive describes how you tend to play once you're in a hand. Those labels are rough, but they reflect how most players tend to think at the table. If you've been raising a lot pre-flop and firing multiple streets, many opponents will start expecting that from you. If you've been quiet and selective, many opponents will start giving your range more credit when you do show up. The key thing to understand is that your image is always being updated. Early in a session, opponents don't have much to go on. They're working from defaults. But as hands accumulate, they're refining their read on you. That process is part of what's often called the metagame. It's the layer of the game that sits above individual hands. You're not just playing cards. You're managing how you're perceived across the whole session. What makes this matter is that your opponent's decisions are shaped by their perception of you. If they think you're loose and aggressive, they're more likely to call you down with marginal hands. On the other hand, if they perceive you as tight, they're more likely to give you credit when you apply pressure. Neither image is inherently better. Each one creates different opportunities and different vulnerabilities. A player who ignores this is likely leaving something real on the table. You might be making technically sound decisions, but if your image is working against you, opponents are more likely to respond in ways that reduce your edge. Staying aware of how you're being perceived is what lets you get ahead of that. And it's what lets you start using it. Number 16. Isolating weak players. You can learn a lot about a table just by watching who limps. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, limping preflop is a weak line. A player who regularly calls the big blind instead of raising is giving you information. They're probably not thinking about range advantage or fold equity. They're likely just trying to see a flop cheaply and hope something good happens. Playing too many hands is another clear signal. When someone is involved in pot after pot and calling opens from out of position with marginal holdings, they're probably not making disciplined decisions. On the other end, a player who plays extremely tight but also limps often can be just as exploitable. Forgetting the blinds or using predictable sizing are additional signals worth noting. Tight alone doesn't mean strong. It depends on how they play when they do get involved. In live games, physical behavior adds another layer of information. Fumbling chips or making string betting errors can signal inexperience. Going on tilt after a bad beat is a sign of emotional instability. A tilting player tends to call too wide. Their decisions often come from frustration rather than logic. That's generally a player you want to be in pots with. In online games, you're looking at stats instead. A player with a VPIP above 40% is voluntarily putting money in the pot before the flop on roughly half of all hands. That's a loose recreational profile and a reliable flag. Once you've identified someone like that, the goal is to get into pots with them alone. An isolation raise does exactly that. When a recreational player limps, you raise enough to fold out the players behind you. The goal is to keep that player in while clearing the field. Position matters here. Doing this from the button or the cutoff means you'll act last on every street. That's where your edge tends to build. Sizing depends on the situation. You'll generally want to go larger when there are players still to act behind you. If the less experienced opponent tends to call almost anything, sizing up also makes sense. The raise needs to be big enough to clear the field without pricing in the whole table. Post-flop is where the work pays off. Recreational players often miss value spots. They'll also call in situations where a more experienced player would fold. In live games, they'll often telegraph uncertainty through their timing and physical behavior. An immediate call can often signal a draw or a weak-made hand. A long pause before checking can suggest they're unsure of their hand's value. Adaptation matters more than any single read. Some weaker players tend to fold too often to any bet. Others will call down with very little. You need enough hands of observation to know which type you're dealing with, because the same physical tell can suggest something different depending on the player. One hand of data isn't enough. You're building a profile over time. Once you have a clearer picture, you can start adjusting your pressure accordingly. Number 17. Mental fortitude, endurance strategies. Your focus tends to be at its sharpest at the start of a session. The decisions tend to feel cleaner. You're tracking positions, reading bet sizes, noticing when someone's timing shifts. But as the hours accumulate, that sharpness starts to fade in ways that aren't always obvious. Fatigue doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly. You miscount a pot. You forget that the player 2 seats to your left has been 3-betting light all night. You make a range assessment based on habit instead of what's actually happening at the table. None of those errors feels catastrophic in the moment, but they compound. Over a long session, a series of small miscalculations can quietly erase what should have been a profitable night. Staying mentally present means you're still tracking bet size deviations on the river. You're still adjusting to new players who sit down mid-session. You're still remembering that the player in the big blind called a 3-bet an hour ago with a hand they shouldn't have. That information is only useful if you're sharp enough to connect it to what's happening right now. Emotional variance is the other side of this. Bad beats and coolers are real events. They tend to create real emotional responses. The problem isn't feeling frustrated. The problem is letting that frustration quietly redirect your decisions. That's what tilt is. It's not always rage. Sometimes it's subtle. You start calling in spots where you'd normally fold. You bluff more than the situation calls for. You stop analyzing ranges and start focusing on getting back to even. The key is recognizing your own triggers before they escalate. For some players, it's a failed bluff. For others, it's being card dead for an extended stretch. Knowing your patterns lets you catch the early signs. You can step back before the decisions deteriorate. Between sessions, the work continues. Reviewing hands with some emotional distance helps. Asking whether your decisions were sound rather than whether they made money builds the kind of mindset that doesn't crack under pressure. That's what resilience actually looks like in poker. It's not about staying emotionally flat. It's about keeping your decision-making stable even when the results aren't going your way. Number 18. Balancing aggression and defense. Imagine a player who misjudges the right moment to press forward or pull back, losing chips in the process. This is where the concept of a dial comes into play, allowing players to adjust their strategies seamlessly between aggression and defense. Knowing when to turn that dial is what separates players who adapt from players who just react. One of the first things to recognize is that the table tends to keep changing. A passive table where players are limping and folding to bets is a different environment than one where players are 3-betting frequently. When you notice the table is passive, that's a signal you can open more hands, fire more continuation bets, and generally apply pressure. When players start putting in raises and 3-bets, that's your cue to pull back, tighten your range, and wait for better spots. That adjustment is what's called shifting gears. The cues are usually readable. If opponents are folding to your bets consistently, your aggressive approach is working. If they're calling you down more often and showing up with strong hands, it's time to shift toward value-focused, cautious play. When a loose and aggressive player sits down, many experienced players tighten their starting hand selection and wait for a spot to trap that player rather than contest every hand. At the core of most decisions in this game is whether the potential gain justifies the risk you're taking. In large pots, A call with a marginal hand puts a significant portion of your stack at risk. That limits your ability to maneuver on later streets. In smaller pots, you can afford to take thinner lines. The downside is more contained. Controlling pot size with medium-strength hands is one of the more reliable ways to keep your risk manageable while still extracting value when you're ahead. When an opponent is the one applying pressure, your job is to figure out what kind of aggression you're facing. Consistent large bets from the same player are data. They tend to tell you something about how that player values their hand. Against a player who bluffs frequently, calling down with strong made hands rather than raising can be the more profitable approach. It tends to keep their bluffing range in the pot longer. Against a player who tends to bet big only with strong hands, folding marginal hands usually costs you very little. Position makes all of this easier. When you're acting last, you have more information before committing chips. That information is what helps you stay balanced without becoming predictable. Number 19. Fine-tuning c-betting strategies. When you flop as the pre-flop aggressor, the board itself tells you a lot about how to proceed. A dry board is disconnected. Picture something like an ace, a 7, and a 2 with no flush draw. A wet board is coordinated. Picture something like a 9, an 8, and a 7 with 2 cards of the same suit. Those two textures call for very different approaches. On dry boards, your range tends to be stronger than your opponent's. They called your raise, and now they're looking at a board that likely missed a good portion of their calling hands. You don't need to bet big to get folds. A bet around a quarter of the pot is often enough to take it down. It also keeps your risk low when you do get called. On wet boards, the situation flips. Your opponent's range connects more often. Draws are everywhere. You'll want to charge those draws to stay ahead. Sizing up to around 2/3 of the pot applies real pressure. It makes chasing draws more expensive. The key principle here is that your sizing should reflect the board, not just your hand. If you size up only when you're strong and size down only when you're weak, observant opponents are likely to pick up on that pattern. Bet sizing is a function of texture and range advantage, not a signal about your specific cards. Now, fold equity is the chance your opponent folds when you bet. When facing a player who folds too often, you can increase your betting frequency slightly. Leaning toward larger sizes tends to work well in that spot. They're giving you free pots. Against a calling station, fold equity is low, so your continuation bets need to be built on actual hand strength. Bluffing into someone who rarely folds tends to be a losing approach over time. Checking back is the part most players underuse. When you check the flop as the pre-flop aggressor, you're not giving up on the hand. You're controlling the pot. You're protecting your equity with medium-strength hands. And you're keeping your checking range credible. If you only check when you have nothing, opponents will attack every check you make. When you occasionally check back a strong hand, your checking range becomes harder to exploit. Opponents are less likely to fire into you freely on the turn because they can't be sure what you have. That uncertainty is worth building. A check back sets up a delayed bet on the turn. By then the pot is smaller and your story is harder to read. Number 20. Managing bankroll for cash games. Your poker bankroll is separate money. It's not rent. It's not savings. It's not money you'd miss if it were gone tomorrow. That separation is the starting point. Without it, every losing session carries weight it shouldn't. That weight changes how you play. Once you've set that money aside, the next question is which stakes to sit at. In no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games, many guidelines suggest keeping somewhere between 20 and 50 full buy-ins for the stakes you're playing. A full buy-in at a 1-2 game is typically $100. If you're sitting down with $100, you'd want somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 set aside before you treat that game as your regular stake. Recreational players can often work with the lower end of that range. More cautious players tend to keep a larger buffer. That's also true for anyone who depends on that bankroll to move up in levels. The number of buy-ins you hold determines how much room you have to absorb losing stretches without dropping down. Variance is what makes those losing stretches happen even when you're playing well. It's the short-term swing in results that's built into the game. You can play correctly for weeks and still run below expectations. Those two things aren't connected. That's not necessarily a sign something's wrong. It's a normal feature of the game. The practical response to a downswing isn't to press harder. It's usually to move down in stakes temporarily. That reduces how fast the damage compounds. Tighter preflop hand selection also tends to flatten out swings over time. That's because you're putting money in with stronger starting positions more consistently. One thing that often gets overlooked is rake. Higher rake environments eat into your edge. That means you'll need a bigger reserve to stay stable at the same level. It also helps to keep a separate emergency fund that has nothing to do with poker. If a downswing threatens your living expenses, the pressure it creates will affect your decisions at the table. Keeping those two things separate protects both. Before each session, decide how much you're willing to lose. A stop loss of around 2 to 3 buy-ins is a common reference point. When you reach that number, you leave. That limit exists to cut off the kind of session where frustration starts driving your decisions. As your bankroll grows or shrinks over time, revisit those limits and adjust them. The number that made sense at one stake won't always make sense at another. Number 21. Capitalizing on short-handed play. When the table shrinks down to 4, 5, or 6 players, the whole rhythm of the game shifts. The blinds come around faster. You're posting more often. That means passivity costs you real money over time. You can't just sit back and wait for premium hands the way you might in a 9-handed game. The math generally doesn't support it. The first thing that has to change is your range. Fewer players at the table means the chance that someone else holds a strong hand on any given deal goes down. Hands like suited connectors and weaker Broadway combinations can become profitable openers from late position because the field isn't deep enough to punish them as consistently. Top pair with a decent kicker becomes a genuinely strong holding because there are fewer opponents who could be sitting on something better. Your 3-betting range expands too, and it makes sense to include suited aces and suited connectors there, since those hands carry fold equity and play well when called. Aggression becomes your main tool in short-handed games. Blind stealing from late position tends to work more often because there are fewer players left to act behind you. When you do get called and see a flop, continuation betting with a wider range tends to generate folds more often because your opponent's range is broad and is unlikely to connect cleanly with most board textures. When you pick up a turn card that's bad for your opponent's perceived range, a second barrel can put them in a difficult spot. The goal isn't to be reckless. It's to recognize that the conditions tend to favor pressure. Applying it consistently is what separates short-handed winners from players who give back their edge. Open raising rather than limping is part of this approach. Isolation raises against limpers fit into the same framework. You want to create heads-up pots where you hold the initiative. Position amplifies everything discussed so far. In a short-handed game, you're in position more often. That means you're exercising this advantage in a higher share of contested hands. Acting last on every post-flop street lets you control pot size with marginal hands. You can take free cards when you need them. And you can apply pressure when your opponent shows weakness. Out-of-position players in the blinds face harder decisions on later streets, which is exactly why 3-betting from the blinds against frequent late-position steals makes sense. It's a way to avoid playing the whole hand from a structural disadvantage. Number 22. Reading flop textures accurately. 3 cards hit the felt. Everything shifts. The way those cards relate to each other tells you more about the situation than almost anything else at that point. Flop texture is how the 3 community cards interact with each other and with the ranges that got to the flop. That interaction shapes most of the decisions you'll make from that point forward. 2 players can both have a continuation bet ready. Whether it makes sense depends almost entirely on what those 3 cards look like together. You're reading 2 primary dimensions of texture. The first is how connected the board is. Connectivity refers to how many straight combinations and straight draws the flop produces. A board with cards close in rank creates a lot of those possibilities. A board with cards spread far apart in rank creates very few. The second dimension is suitedness. A rainbow flop means 3 different suits are present. It can also be two-tone, where 2 cards share a suit. Or it can be monotone, meaning all 3 cards share the same suit. Each of those creates a different level of flush draw potential. When a board has high connectivity and 2 or more cards of the same suit, it's called a coordinated or wet board. That kind of board carries above-average potential for straights, flushes, and draws. A board like King, Queen, 10 with 2 of the same suit is a strong example of that. Multiple straight combinations are already present, and a flush draw is live. A dry or uncoordinated board is the opposite. It carries below-average potential for straights, flushes, and draws. A board like King, 3, 2 with 3 different suits is a clear example of that. The cards don't connect in ways that create many drawing possibilities, and there's no flush draw to consider. A board like Jack, 8, 3 with 2 suited cards sits somewhere in between. It's more coordinated than the dry example because of the flush draw and some straight possibilities. It's not as dense with drawing combinations as the King, Queen, 10 board. The reason this distinction matters is that it gives you a sense of how many hands in your opponent's range are still live and improving. On a dry board, most hands tend to be already defined. On a wet board, a lot of hands are still in motion. Number 23. Extracting value from marginal hands. You don't need the nuts to get paid. Sometimes a medium-strength hand, played in the right spot against the right opponent, earns just as much as a strong one would. A thin value bet is a bet you make when you don't have a great hand, but you think your opponent will call with something worse. The hand doesn't have to be strong. It just has to be ahead of enough hands in their calling range to make the bet worth making. Middle pair can be a thin value bet on the right board against the right player. Top pair with a weak kicker can qualify too. The key question tends to be the same. What worse hands will they actually call with? The board texture matters a lot here. When the board is dry and draws have missed, your opponent's range narrows. They're less likely to have 2 pair or a set. They're more likely to be sitting with a medium strength made hand, uncertain whether to call your river bet. That's the kind of spot where a small or medium-sized bet with this kind of holding starts to make sense. Knowing your opponent matters just as much as the board. When facing a player who calls frequently with weak holdings, you can bet thinner and sometimes a bit larger. In contrast, with a tight player who folds to river pressure, a thin value bet with a hand like this often just takes the pot without getting called by worse. That's not a value bet anymore. That's a bluff, even if you didn't intend it to be one. The danger with a hand in this range is that players start treating them like strong ones. They bet big. They call raises. They build large pots. When your opponent raises your river bet, and they almost never bluff, that's a strong signal your hand may not be as strong as you thought. Marginal hands need pot control. That means smaller bets and fewer streets of aggression. It also means being willing to check and take a free showdown when the situation isn't clearly in your favor. Most of the time when you bet and get called, or bet and get raised, there's something to learn from it. A quick call from a loose player tells you they're comfortable calling with weak hands. A fold from a tight player tells you your sizing was too large for the situation. You adjust from there. Hand by hand. Opponent by opponent. Number 24. Exploiting overly aggressive bluffers. Some players at the table aren't trying to outplay you hand by hand. They're trying to outrun you with aggression, betting frequently enough that you fold more than you should. Once you recognize that pattern, you can stop reacting to their aggression and start using it against them. The first thing to look for is bet frequency. A player who continuation bets most flops and still fires the turn on more than half of them can't be doing that with strong hands every time. Their range simply doesn't support it. When this player also has a 3-bet frequency that's noticeably higher than everyone else at the table, and they rarely go to showdown, their range is likely weighted heavily toward bluffs and semi-bluffs. In live games, the tell is often simpler. Someone who bets quickly on almost every flop regardless of texture is running on autopilot. The same is true of someone who routinely opens to 8 or 10 times the big blind and then barrels most boards. That pattern is worth exploiting once you've observed it consistently over enough hands. The core adjustment against someone playing this way is patience. When you make a strong hand, there's often no need to announce it immediately. Checking top set on a dry flop, or flat calling pre-flop with a premium hand to keep their full bluffing range in the pot, sets up a situation where they're likely doing the work for you. Stacks of at least 100 big blinds make this especially profitable. Their escalating bet sizes on the turn and river inflate the pot significantly by the time you're ready to act. The longer you wait, the more they tend to invest in a story they can't easily back up. Check raising is the other major tool. Checking to this player and then raising their bet tends to accomplish two things at once. It puts pressure on hands they shouldn't continue with. It also tends to produce a visible reaction you can use going forward. Sizing the check raise large enough to threaten their stack by the river discourages them from floating with pure air. It also tends to extract value from their overplayed marginal hands. The key is selectivity. These adjustments work best when directed at the specific player you've identified, not the whole table. A tight image makes your check raises more credible. That tends to produce more folds from their bluffs and more calls from their overvalued hands. Number 25. Understanding and utilizing reverse implied odds. You're putting money in the pot right now, but the real question isn't what you win if you hit. It's what you lose when you hit and still have the worst hand. That's the core of this concept. When you're drawing, you're usually thinking about what happens if you get there. This flips that question. It asks how much you'll likely put in on later streets if your hand improves but theirs improves more. It also applies when their hand was already better and stays that way. Regular pot odds compare the cost of a call to the size of the current pot. That's a snapshot of right now. This concept extends that picture forward. It accounts for the chips you'll likely put in on the turn and river when you've made a hand that feels strong but isn't strong enough. The clearest example of this is a non-nut flush draw. You're drawing to a flush. Your opponent is drawing to a higher flush. You both get there. You've improved. You've hit your draw. And you're likely to lose a big pot. That's about as direct an example of this risk working against you as you'll find. Stack depth tends to make this worse. The deeper the effective stacks, the more room there is for large bets on later streets. A dominated hand in a deep stacked pot can cost you far more than the original call suggested. When you're thinking through whether a draw is worth pursuing, it's not enough to project the pot you'd win. It helps to mentally discount that pot by the portion you'd likely lose when you complete to second best. If that discount is large enough, the call can become unprofitable even when the direct pot odds look fine. The practical adjustment is to favor nut draws over non-nut draws when you have the choice. A draw to the best possible hand carries little risk when it completes. A draw to a medium flush or the low end of a straight tends to carry more risk. That's especially true when the board and your opponent's range suggest they could be drawing to something better. Tightening your draw selection on the flop and turn is one of the more reliable ways to protect yourself. The hands that tend to hurt you most aren't the ones that miss. They're often the ones that hit just enough to keep you paying. Number 26. Dynamic range balancing. It's not about hiding your hand. It's about making sure your betting lines don't tell a story that opponents can read and respond to profitably. Here's the core idea. When you bet or raise, your range includes every hand you take that action with in that spot. If you only bet with strong hands and check with weak ones, a sharp opponent can figure that out fairly quickly. Once they do, they can fold when you bet and attack when you check. That's an exploitable pattern. It tends to cost you money over time. Dynamic range balancing means you spread your actions across a wider mix of hand strengths. You're not just asking what your hand is worth. You're asking what your betting line looks like from the outside. You're asking whether an opponent can narrow your range down to one type of holding. The goal is to make your bets and raises harder to respond to. When your range in a given spot contains both strong hands and weaker ones, your opponent can't simply overfold or overcall and come out ahead. They're pushed toward tougher decisions because either response carries real risk. Mixing hand strengths also applies to how you use different bet sizes. Ideally, each sizing you reach for should contain a reasonable spread of strong and weak hands. If your large bets tend to mean strength and your small bets tend to mean weakness, you've handed opponents a reliable signal. Occasionally betting a strong hand at a smaller size disrupts that pattern. So does including a weaker hand in a larger sizing. Now, balancing isn't a rigid formula you apply the same way every session. It shifts based on who you're playing against. Against a player who calls too frequently, you can lean your range toward value. You can also thin out the bluffs. When someone folds too often to aggression, you can add more weaker hands to your betting range. That lets you apply pressure more freely. The baseline balance exists to protect you against observant opponents. Against opponents with clear tendencies, you adjust away from it on purpose. Positional awareness matters here too. From early positions, your range is naturally tighter and more value-heavy. From later positions, you have room to include more speculative hands. That creates a wider mix that's harder to read. Small, consistent adjustments in range composition build meaningful edges over time. Extreme overcorrections tend to create new imbalances rather than resolve the old ones. Number 27. Mastering the art of the check raise. The reversal of aggression is a powerful tactic in poker. Your check suggested weakness. Your opponent responded by betting. Now the raise lands with real weight because they've already committed chips. That reversal is what makes the check raise one of the more powerful moves available in a cash game. You're not just building a pot. You're shifting who holds the initiative. The player who was driving the action is now the one facing a decision. With a strong made hand, the check raise tends to build a larger pot than a straightforward lead would. Your opponent bets. You raise. Now they're putting in more money than they would have if you'd simply bet out yourself. When holding a strong draw, it can work as a semi-bluff. You've got equity to fall back on. You're also applying pressure that can win the pot outright. The spots where this works best share a few common traits. Being out of position is what makes the play possible. You act first, so you can check. Your opponent bets. Now you raise. In multi-way pots, there's more uncertainty about whether a bet is coming. That's why the cleaner check-raise opportunities tend to come up heads up against the pre-flop aggressor. Board texture matters quite a bit. When the board favors your range more than your opponent's, you have what's called a nut advantage. You're more likely to hold the strongest hands on that texture. That's when solvers and experienced players tend to increase check-raise frequency. On wet, connected boards, larger sizing can make sense because you're denying equity to drawing hands. On dry boards, smaller sizing tends to invite calls from worse-made hands. Opponent tendencies sharpen the decision further. Someone with a high continuation bet frequency and a wide opening range is likely betting a lot of hands that can't withstand a raise. Their range tends to include weak pairs, overcards, and air. A check raise puts pressure on them to either fold that equity or put in more chips than the situation warrants. Over time, opponents who face frequent check raises often start pulling back on their continuation bets. They tighten up. That adjustment can work in your favor too. When your checking range gets more respect, you're in a better position to take free cards when you need them. Number 28. Leveraging pot control. You've got a hand you like. You're just not sure how far you want to take it. That uncertainty is where this concept starts to matter. The idea is to manage how large the total at stake gets relative to the strength of your hand. It's not about playing scared. Some hands are strong enough to win small and medium amounts, but not strong enough to justify playing for your entire stack. Those hands exist, and they're more common than most players account for. Top pair is the clearest example. You're ahead of most of your opponent's range. But if the total at stake gets very large, you can end up in a spot where folding feels too expensive and calling feels too risky. Keeping the total at stake where your hand is comfortable is the whole point. Over many sessions, that kind of discipline can reduce extreme swings and lead to more consistent results. One of the most common ways to do this is checking behind when you're in position. When you check back on the turn instead of betting, you skip a round of betting entirely. The total at stake stays where it is. You get to see the river without putting in more chips with a hand that might be ahead but is also vulnerable. Position makes this easier because you'll generally have the option to check last. Out of position, it's harder to manage how much is in the middle. Your opponent can still bet into you regardless of what you do. Smaller bet sizing is the other tool. Instead of building a large total at stake with a continuation bet, you can use a smaller sizing that keeps things manageable while still applying some pressure. On draw-heavy boards especially, this tends to matter. You're charging draws without committing yourself to a large amount if you get raised. When you're holding a marginal hand, the goal shifts. You're not trying to maximize value. You're trying to avoid a situation where you'd have to make a large decision with uncertain equity. Checking on the turn with a medium-strength hand is a common way to do that. It keeps the river bet smaller. It keeps your total exposure in a range you can absorb. If the total at stake does grow beyond what your hand can support, folding to significant aggression on a later street is still a valid response. You're limiting how much more goes in. That restraint is part of the same idea. Number 29. Adjusting to opponent's skill levels. Watch the table before you play a single hand. That's where the information lives. The first thing you're looking for is how often someone enters a pot. A player who's in nearly every hand is loose. A player who sits back and waits is tight. Neither label tells you everything. They give you a starting point. From there, watch whether they limp or raise. Limping into pots repeatedly is a passive tendency. Raising is aggressive. Those two things together start to build a picture of who you're dealing with. Pay attention to bet sizing. Skilled players tend to keep their sizing consistent relative to the pot. They're thinking in terms of range. They're not sizing based on the strength of one specific hand. Weaker players often size based on how much they like their cards. A big bet tends to mean a big hand. A small bet tends to mean they're unsure. When you see that pattern repeat, it becomes something you can work with. Newer players also tend to call down with weak holdings just to find out what you have. Chasing draws without considering whether the price makes sense is common. They'll overvalue top pair regardless of what the board is doing around it. Limping in from early position with hands they find pretty is another tendency. These tendencies are consistent. Consistency is what you exploit. Against a player like that, you don't need to get fancy. When you have a strong hand, build the pot. Keep betting. They'll often call with worse. When the board changes and your hand is still good, don't slow down expecting them to fold. They often won't fold. Let them pay you off. Against a skilled opponent, the approach shifts. You're not trying to build big pots with medium-strength hands. You're controlling the size of the pot and picking your spots carefully. Bluffing less often makes sense. A good player is paying attention to your frequencies. Varying your lines makes it harder for them to pin down your range. Sometimes you check strong hands. Sometimes you bet them. Position matters more against skilled opponents too. Getting into complex spots out of position against someone who outplays people after the flop is worth avoiding most of the time. The table you're sitting at changes constantly. The players change. Your strategy has to move with it. Number 30. Executing the double-barrel bluff. You raise pre-flop. Your opponent calls. A bet on the flop follows. That's a continuation bet. A double-barrel bluff is when you bet the turn as well, even though you don't have a strong hand. This strategy applies pressure across 2 streets instead of 1. The reason this works is that many opponents find it harder to continue calling without a real hand. One bet on the flop is easy to call with a weak pair or a draw. 2 bets in a row raise the cost of staying in the hand. Your opponent has to weigh whether they can call again, and often they decide they can't. This matters most in cash games because the pots are real money and opponents are making decisions based on what they think you have. Sustained aggression tells a story. It suggests your hand is strong enough to keep betting. When that story is believable, opponents fold hands they might have held onto if you check the turn. Now, the story only works if it's not always a bluff. That's where balance comes in. If you double barrel every time you miss the flop, thinking opponents will always fold, they'll eventually notice. They'll start calling you down lighter because they know your bets don't always mean strength. On the other side, if you almost never bluff the turn, opponents will tend to fold to your second barrel only when they have very little, and they'll call or raise you when they have something worth defending. Neither extreme is good for your expected value over time. The goal is to mix your double-barrel bluffs in with your genuine value bets often enough that opponents can't easily figure out which one you're doing. When they're uncertain, they're more likely to make mistakes. Those mistakes are where a lot of your profit tends to come from. The turn card itself is a big part of this decision. Some turn cards help your range as the pre-flop raiser. An ace on the turn, for example, connects with a lot of hands a pre-flop raiser would have. That tends to be a card that supports another bet. A turn card that completes obvious draws on a wet board is generally harder to barrel into, because it may have improved your opponent's hand rather than yours. Reading the board as it develops helps you decide when a second barrel makes sense and when it doesn't. Number 31. Recognizing and exploiting leaks. Some players give away information on every street. They don't know they're doing it. The patterns are there if you're paying attention. Start with bet sizing. When someone only uses a large bet with a strong hand, they're telling you something every time they act. When that same player checks or bets small, you can start narrowing their range. The sizing becomes the signal. It's worth noticing whether someone's bet sizes stay consistent across hand strengths or shift depending on what they're holding. Inconsistency is a leak. Consistency that's tied to hand strength is an even bigger one. Continuation betting frequency is another place to look. Players who bet every flop regardless of board texture tend to run into problems. They're often not thinking about whether the board connects with the range they represented pre-flop. When you identify someone doing this, you can start floating or raising on boards where their range should be weak. On the other side, those who almost never bet the flop out of position are likely checking too wide. They're probably giving up more equity than they should. You can take pots from them by betting into them with reasonable frequency. They've shown you they'll tend to fold unless they have something strong. Positional errors are closely related. Some players call raises from early position with hands that don't play well out of position. They're likely to face tough spots on nearly every street. When you're in position against someone like that, you can apply consistent pressure and let their positional disadvantage do the work. They'll often fold to aggression because they don't have a clear plan for navigating the hand out of position. Psychological state matters too. Players on tilt tend to bet erratically and play more hands than they should. That's a spot where your value bets are likely to get called wider. Reduce your bluffing frequency and focus on getting paid with strong holdings. Players playing scared will tend to fold to pressure more than they should. That opens up more room for aggression. Overconfident players will tend to call you down with marginal hands. Tighten your bluffing range and build bigger pots when you have a strong holding. The common thread across all of it is observation. The information is already there. You just have to be watching. Number 32. Implementing mixed strategy approaches. You can play the same hand two different ways, and both can be correct. That's what a mixed strategy is built around. Instead of betting every time you're strong or checking every time you're weak, you vary your actions across similar situations. The goal is simple. You want your opponent to have a harder time figuring out what you're holding based on how you bet. In no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games, this matters because observant opponents are constantly building a picture of you. If you continuation bet your strong hands consistently and check your weak ones predictably, a good player will start to read you accurately. A mixed approach disrupts that process. It doesn't mean being random for no reason. It means having more than one legitimate action available in a given spot. You use both of them over time. How you mix also depends on who you're playing against. Against a loose, aggressive player who fires at every sign of weakness, checking a strong hand occasionally lets them do the betting for you. Against a tight, passive player who rarely bluffs, betting for value more consistently makes sense because they won't punish you for it. The mix shifts based on what your opponent is likely to do with the information your action gives them. Balancing aggression and caution is where this gets practical. Betting and raising builds pots when you're ahead. It also generates fold equity when you're not. Checking and calling controls the pot size. It keeps you in hands where you need more information before committing chips. Neither approach is right in every situation. Position matters. Stack depth matters. A deep stacked pot with a strong but vulnerable hand might call for a smaller and more cautious line. You want to avoid building a pot you can't comfortably navigate. That same hand in a shallower spot might warrant more aggression. Strategic flexibility means you're watching how the table is changing and adjusting as it does. A player who bets strong hands consistently and folds to aggression predictably is easy to play against. Opponents figure out the pattern and exploit it. When you stay adaptable and focus on ranges rather than fixed responses, you stay harder to read over a long session. The player who keeps opponents guessing tends to put them in harder spots. When they can't simplify their decisions against you, they're more likely to make mistakes. Number 33. Understanding and applying GTO concepts. You don't need to know what your opponent is holding to make a good decision. What matters more is knowing what your own strategy looks like across all the hands you could be holding in that spot. GTO is a mathematical approach to poker strategy. The goal is to construct a strategy that can't be profitably attacked, even if your opponent knows exactly how you're playing. It's not about any single hand. It's about the full hand distribution you show up with in a given situation. How you distribute your actions across that hand distribution is what defines your strategy. The theoretical foundation comes from John Nash's work on equilibrium strategies. His key papers appeared in 1950 and 1951, and the concept he described became the basis for how GTO solutions are framed. In a Nash equilibrium, neither player can improve their result by changing their strategy unilaterally. That's the target GTO is built around. Now, a true GTO solution for full-stack no-limit hold'em doesn't exist yet in a computable form. The game is too complex for current methods to fully solve. What we work with are approximations, and those approximations are still useful because they teach you how to think about balance. Balancing your hand distribution means that when you take a specific action, your range includes both value hands and bluffs in proportions that make your opponent indifferent. Betting the river is a good example of this. If you bet pot on the river, your opponent needs to call roughly 1 out of every 3 times to make your bluffs break even. If your hand distribution is balanced at the right bluff-to-value ratio, calling and folding both yield roughly 0 expected value for them. Neither option beats the other. That's the indifference you're creating. On earlier streets, balance works the same way. Your pre-flop opens include speculative hands alongside strong ones. Your flop bets include backdoor draws alongside top pair. Your checking range includes strong hands, so opponents can't attack it freely. Exploitative play moves in the opposite direction. Instead of protecting against the best possible opponent, you target the specific mistakes the player in front of you is actually making. Against someone who folds too much, you bluff more. Against someone who calls too much, you cut your bluffs and lean toward value. GTO tends to be the better default against strong or unfamiliar opponents. Exploitive adjustments become more useful once you've identified a clear and repeatable tendency in the player in front of you. The skill is knowing which approach fits the situation. Number 34. Navigating high-pressure situations. The biggest pots tend to arrive without warning. One moment you're playing a routine hand. The next you're facing a bet that could cost you a significant portion of your stack. What happens in your body in that moment matters more than most players tend to realize. Stress in poker tends to follow predictable patterns. Facing a large bet on the turn or river when stacks are deep is one of the more common ones. Extended losing streaks across many sessions can wear on you in ways that show up at the table. That happens even when you're trying to stay focused. Being card dead for long stretches builds a low-grade frustration. That frustration can quietly push you toward poor decisions. In live games, casino noise and fatigue add another layer. Online, the sheer volume of hands compresses that stress into shorter windows. The first step is learning to notice your own signals. A rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, or the urge to act quickly without thinking are all signs that stress is already affecting your decisions. Once you can recognize those signals, you're in a position to do something about them. Stepping away from the table briefly between hands is one option. Running through a short mental checklist before you act is another. Simply pausing to assess your emotional state during a big pot can also help. All of these are practical ways to interrupt the stress response before it shapes your decision. The second piece is how you think about outcomes. Poker has variance built into it by design. Even a well-reasoned decision can lose in the short run because that's how probabilistic games work. If you judge your decisions by whether you won the pot, you're measuring the wrong thing. What you want to measure is whether your reasoning was sound given what you knew at the time. Were you thinking about ranges? Did you account for position and stack depth? Were you following your strategic criteria? That's the process. The outcome of any single hand tends to tell you very little about whether you played it well. Breathing is the most immediate tool you have for resetting under pressure. A slow inhale through the nose followed by a longer exhale activates a calming response in your nervous system. You can pair that with a quiet mental count to give it more structure. While another player is acting, you have time to do this without anyone noticing. A few slow breaths won't solve a difficult decision, but they'll clear enough mental clutter that you can think more clearly when it's your turn. Number 35. Exploiting predictable betting patterns. You don't need to guess what an opponent is going to do if they've already shown you often enough. In no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games, a betting pattern is a repeated sequence of actions and bet sizes that a player uses across similar situations over many hands. When someone consistently raises to the same size pre-flop, fires a continuation bet on most flops, and then shuts down on the turn without a strong hand, that's rarely a coincidence. That's a tendency. And patterns tend to carry information. The first step is building a baseline. You want to understand what a player's normal behavior looks like before you start drawing conclusions. That means tracking their bet sizing across streets, how often they check versus bet, and how fast they act. In live games, you're doing this mentally or with physical notes. Online, you can use the note-taking tools built into the poker client. Either way, you're looking for consistency across enough hands and showdowns to feel reasonably confident the behavior is real. Once you've identified what looks like a reliable habit, you can start building a counter strategy around it. The adjustment should be specific. Pick one clear thing to target. If a player rarely 4-bets, you can 3-bet them more liberally with a wider range. If a player bets big only with strong hands and checks back marginal ones, you can fold more often when they fire large. You can also attack them when they show weakness. Against players who overfold to flop bets, you'll want to increase your continuation bet frequency. Against players who call too wide, you tighten your bluffing and widen your value range. The key is staying flexible. Opponents adjust. Regulars who play with you often are especially likely to notice your tendencies. If you keep applying the same counter strategy after someone has changed their behavior, you're the one being exploited. You update your read when the evidence changes, not before and not after. Setting a trap is where the passive line becomes a weapon. Against a player who habitually bets when checked to, you check your strong hands and let them build the pot for you. You're not giving up initiative. You're using their aggression as a tool instead. When their betting behavior commits them to the pot, that's when you raise. Not before. The goal is to reach that moment without revealing your intentions too soon. The pattern is the tell. Your job is to be patient enough to see it clearly before you act on it. Number 36. Mastering the triple barrel bluff. You're putting in bets on 3 streets as a bluff. That's a significant commitment, and it only makes sense in specific situations. The question isn't whether you can do it. The question is whether the spot supports it. Start with your opponent. You're looking for someone whose range is capped. That means they've taken a line that makes it unlikely they hold a very strong hand by the time you reach the river. When an opponent's range is capped, they don't have many hands that can comfortably call 3 bets. That's the kind of opponent where sustained pressure tends to work. If your opponent is someone who regularly shows up with the nuts in spots like this, the triple barrel loses most of its value. Board texture matters just as much. You want a board that fits the range your opponent expects you to have as the pre-flop aggressor. When the board connects well with your perceived range, your bets tell a believable narrative. Dry boards often support this because they don't give your opponent's calling hands much reason to feel confident. On each street, you're asking whether the texture still supports the line you started on the flop. You can't run bluffs on 3 streets without also having value hands in that same line. If you only triple barrel as a bluff, a thinking opponent will likely figure that out over time and start calling you down. Your value hands and your bluff hands need to look the same from the outside. That's what keeps your line believable to a thinking opponent. On the river, your betting range should be polarized. You're either very strong or you're bluffing. Hands with decent showdown value, like top pair, are generally better served by checking. They don't need to bluff. They're also not strong enough to comfortably call a raise if you face one. When you're selecting bluff hands for this line, favor ones that block the hands your opponent might call with. That tends to reduce the number of strong holdings they can actually have. The river card is where the decision gets refined. Completing a draw changes what your opponent's range looks like. When the river card fits your story, it gives you more credibility. However, a blank doesn't automatically mean you should fire. You're asking whether your line still holds. You're also asking whether your opponent's range is weak enough to fold. Number 37. Adapting to changing table dynamics. You're playing against people, not just cards. And people change. Someone who was folding to every raise an hour ago might have stacked someone. Now they're opening every other hand. Someone who was splashing around might have taken a bad beat. Now they've gone completely quiet. The table you sat down at isn't the same table you're playing at now. That gap matters. The most useful thing you can do between hands is watch. Not just your own cards, but what's happening around you. Watch when someone's bet sizing jumps up. Watch when a player who was talkative goes silent. Watch when a short stack moves in for the third time in 20 minutes. These aren't random. They're data points about how the game has shifted. Showdowns are especially valuable. When someone turns over a hand you didn't expect, that tells you something real about their range. You don't need to guess as much anymore. You have real information to work with. And you can adjust from that point forward. Once you've spotted a shift, the next step is translating it into a strategic response. If the table tightens up and players are folding more often, that's a signal to widen your late position opening range and apply more pressure. Conversely, when the table loosens up and players are calling everything, you should tighten your range and focus on hands that hold up in multi-way pots. The same logic applies to aggression. A passive table rewards you for betting more often. Opponents who are overfolding to flop bets are suggesting that continuation bets will tend to show a profit. Against a table full of callers, bluffing frequency should drop. You're unlikely to fold them out, so it's worth shifting your focus. Shift toward value and let them pay you off. Stack depth plays into this too. When you're deep relative to the table, speculative hands tend to go up in value. When short stacks are shoving frequently, marginal spots become less appealing. You'll want stronger holdings before committing. The trap most players fall into is locking onto one approach and riding it through the whole session. What worked 2 hours ago might be the wrong play right now. The players who tend to stay ahead are the ones who keep checking whether their current strategy still fits the table in front of them. Number 38. Understanding opponent hand ranges. Before a single flop card hits the felt, you already have information. You know where your opponent is sitting. You've seen how they played before this hand. You know whether they raised, called, or limped. That's enough to start building a picture of what they're likely holding. A pre-flop hand range is just the collection of starting hands a player could reasonably have given everything you've observed. Position shapes the collection more than almost anything else. A player opening from under the gun in a full ring game is facing a lot of players still to act. That means they're likely working with something around the top 13 to 15% of hands. Strong pairs, premium Broadway combinations, that sort of thing. The button faces almost nobody left to act. That range expands dramatically, sometimes reaching 40 or 50% of all starting hands. Player type matters too. A tight player's range sits closer to 8 or 10% even from middle position. A loose player might be opening hands that a tight player would rarely consider. You're not guessing randomly. You're using what you've seen to place them somewhere on that spectrum. Once the flop comes out, the narrowing process begins. Every action your opponent takes removes some hands from their range and keeps others. If they bet into a coordinated board, hands that don't connect with that texture start to fall away. If they check back after raising pre-flop, their range often becomes capped. That tends to mean it doesn't contain the strongest hands that would normally want to build the pot. When they call a significant turn bet, you can generally infer they have something with real equity or showdown value. Very weak hands tend to give up there. By the river, you've often filtered their range down considerably. Now you can start identifying the structural weaknesses in what's left. A capped range tends to struggle calling large bets. Sizing up is often the right response. Medium-strength hands are vulnerable to pressure because they can't beat much. When a wide calling range is combined with a narrow value betting range, your opponent is often reaching showdown with hands they can't win with. That opens the door for thin value bets that add up over time. The whole process is cumulative. Each street gives you new data. Each action updates your picture. The more accurately you track that, the sharper your decisions tend to become. Number 39. Exploiting overconfidence. Some players sit down already certain they've got the table figured out. They haven't looked at a single hand yet, but their posture, their bet sizing, and the way they dismiss a raise all say the same thing. They think they're the best player there. That belief shows up in their play in predictable ways. Often, they bluff more than the situation calls for. Large bets are their go-to when smaller ones would do the same job. Calling raises they'd be better off folding to is common, because folding feels like admitting something. And when the board changes on the turn or river, adjustments are rare. They stay attached to the hand they thought they had before the board changed the story. The dismissive part matters too. When a player underweights what their opponents are capable of, they stop gathering information. They're not watching how you've been playing. They're not thinking about what your range looks like. That's a gap you can use. Against this type of player, well-timed aggression does real work. A 3-bet at the right moment doesn't just put chips in the middle. It forces a decision they weren't prepared for. Overconfident players often read aggression as a challenge to their status rather than as a strategic signal. That reaction can lead them to call too wide, or it can push them towards shoving into a range they're likely behind against. Either way, you've shifted the dynamic in your favor. Slow playing strong hands against them can also be effective. If they're inclined to bet big and represent strength, letting them build the pot before you raise can extract more value than leading outward. They'll often read your passivity as weakness and continue firing. The discipline side of this is just as important as the aggression side. You're not trying to outbluff them. You're waiting for spots where their miscalculation is apparent, and then you're making the technically sound play. That means folding when the situation calls for it, even if they're showing tells. It means not speeding up your own game just because they're being reckless. Observation is what keeps the whole thing working. Their patterns will shift slightly as the session goes on. Staying attentive to those shifts is what makes the adjustments easier to find. Number 40. Implementing advanced float plays. You call the flop with a hand that isn't strong yet. This isn't about chasing a draw or trapping with a monster. The call is because you think your opponent is weak. The plan is to take the pot away from them on a later street. The mechanics are simple. Your opponent raises pre-flop and bets the flop. You call. Then they check the turn. That check is the opening. You bet, representing a hand stronger than what you actually have. The goal is to win the pot before the river, without needing to show your cards. What makes this work is the opponent's pattern, not just one bet. Look for players who continuation bet the flop at a high rate but slow down dramatically on the turn. When someone bets the flop roughly 70% of the time or more but checks the turn far more often, that pattern suggests a lot of their flop bets aren't backed by real strength. They're firing automatically and then giving up. Bet sizing matters too. A small bet on the flop, especially on a dry board, can signal a weak range. A player firing small into a board that doesn't connect well with a wide range may often be going through the motions. That's when you call and wait. Position matters a great deal here. The classic float happens in position, so you'll typically have the option to check back if the situation doesn't develop cleanly. Heads-up pots tend to be the cleaner environment because you're only reading one opponent. In multi-way pots, the dynamics get complicated and the read becomes less reliable. When the opponent checks the turn, your bet needs to be sized to apply real pressure. Somewhere between half pot and 3/4 pot is a reasonable target. The idea is to make it difficult for someone holding overcards or a weak pair to continue. The goal isn't to build a pot, but to end the hand. If the turn card improves your equity at all, even through a backdoor draw, that's a bonus. It doesn't change the plan. It does give you a little extra coverage if you get called and have to play the river. Number 41. Maximizing value with strong hands. You're trying to get paid. That's the whole point of making a strong hand. But getting paid well is a skill, and it's one that a lot of players underestimate because they think the hard part is already done once they've made the hand. It isn't. The first thing you need to figure out is whether the spot you're in is actually a good value betting spot. Not every strong hand prints money. The value comes from your opponent's calling range, not from your hand in isolation. So before you size up and fire, you want to know something about who you're betting into. Start with what you've seen. Has this player been calling down with second pair? Have they called large bets on the river with obvious bluff catchers? Have they shown up at Showdown with hands that most players would have folded 2 streets ago? That's your signal. When someone has a pattern of calling too wide, your strong hand becomes more valuable because their calling range is full of hands that are worse than yours. You're not just betting into air. You're betting into a range that's going to call you more often than it should. On the other side, if you're up against a player who only continues when they have something real, you need to adjust what you expect to get paid on. Tight players fold a lot. They're unlikely to call you down with weak top pair or a busted draw. When facing these players, your value betting spots are narrower and you need to be more selective about when you go for multiple streets of value. Recreational players in live games tend to call too many river bets. They came to play. They've got chips in the pot. They want to see what you have. That creates real value betting opportunities on later streets. In online games, regulars are more predictable in a different way. Some call down light. Some fold to aggression frequently. Some chase draws hard. Once you've tagged someone with a tendency, you can use it. Showdowns are information. Every time you see someone's cards at the end of a hand, you're updating your read on what they're willing to call with. Keep track of that. It's not just about the hand that just finished. It's about the next time you have a strong hand and you're deciding how hard to press. Here's something that trips people up. They make a strong hand and they immediately start betting big every time because they want to get paid. The problem is that if you only bet big when you're strong, observant opponents can figure that out fairly quickly. You're essentially announcing your hand through your sizing. The fix is consistency. Your bet sizes should be driven by board texture and pot size, not by how strong your specific hand is. If you're betting 2/3 of the pot on a dry flop with a medium hand, you should be betting 2/3 of the pot on that same texture with a strong hand too. The size shouldn't change just because your cards changed. When you keep your sizing consistent across your whole range, opponents can't use your bet size as a direct read on your strength. The same idea applies pre-flop. If you open raise to a consistent size from each position, you're not giving away whether you've got aces or a suited connector. The moment you start raising bigger with premium hands, you've given observant opponents a reliable tell. Timing matters in online games the same way physical behavior matters in live games. If you always act quickly with marginal hands and then pause before betting your strong ones, you're leaking information. Keep your decision timing consistent. In live games, the equivalent is your demeanor. How you handle your chips. How you sit. How much you talk. If any of that changes noticeably when you make a big hand, experienced players will pick up on it. Check raising is worth mentioning here too. If you only check raise when you have the nuts, that's a pattern opponents can exploit. They'll just fold when you check raise and continue when you don't. You want check raises to show up in your strategy with semi-bluffs as well, so the move itself doesn't give away your exact strength. Let's dive into how to actually size your bets to get the most money in. The goal is to find the largest bet size your opponent will still call. That's not the largest bet you can make. It's the largest bet they'll actually call with a worse hand. Those are different things. Against a calling station, you don't need to bet small to keep them in. They'll usually call anyway. You can size up on later streets and still get called with hands that have no business calling. That's where a meaningful portion of your profit tends to come from with those players. A half-pot bet might get the same call as a 3/4 pot bet. But the 3/4 pot bet puts more money in when you win. When dealing with a tight player, the opposite is true. A large bet might fold out everything you're beating. A smaller bet keeps their calling range wider and gets you more calls from worse hands over time. You're sacrificing some pot size in exchange for a higher call frequency. Against tight players, that's usually the right trade. On scary rivers, where the board has run out in a way that connects with a lot of hands, a smaller value bet can make sense even with a strong hand. You're not trying to fold out the hands that beat you. You're trying to get called by the hands you're beating. A smaller size reduces the risk of facing a raise from someone who actually got there, while still extracting value from the hands that didn't. Stack depth matters too. Deeper stacks mean more money can go in post-flop. Your pre-flop sizing should reflect that. When you construct a bigger pot pre-flop, you have more room to bet meaningfully on each street after. The idea running through all of this is that value extraction isn't automatic. It requires reading the player in front of you. It requires keeping your own behavior consistent enough that they can't read you back. And it requires choosing a size that fits what they're actually willing to call. Number 42. Recognizing and avoiding traps. Sometimes the most useful information comes from what your opponent isn't doing. When someone who's been betting consistently across streets suddenly slows down, that shift carries information. If a player who rarely raises fires in a big one out of nowhere, that carries information too. In no-limit Texas Hold'em, putting an opponent on a range means tracking everything they've done up to that point. A single action that doesn't fit their pattern is worth noticing. Unusual bet sizing is one of the more reliable signals. Many players settle into a rhythm with their sizing. When that changes, it can be a sign that their hand strength has changed too. A very small bet into a large pot can be an invitation to put more chips in. On the other hand, a very large bet on a board that just got more dangerous can mean they've connected with it. These aren't rules. Both deserve a second look before you respond. Board texture matters here as well. Late position pressure on a coordinated board tends to be more credible than the same pressure on a dry board. A coordinated board is one that connects well with a wide range of hands. If the action you're seeing doesn't match the board, that gap is worth sitting with for a moment. Your own hand matters just as much. Medium-strength hands are where most traps do their damage. Top pair looks strong until you think about what your opponent needs to hold to be playing this aggressively. In cash games, hands that face significant reverse implied odds on later streets tend to be the ones that quietly bleed chips. Reverse implied odds means that when you're behind, you tend to lose a lot. When you're ahead, you don't get paid much. That's a bad trade. Stack-to-pot ratio helps frame this. If the remaining stacks are large relative to the pot, you still have room to maneuver. Once that ratio gets low, decisions become more committed. Recognizing that change early gives you a chance to step back before you're too far in. Position gives you one more tool. Acting last means you see what your opponent does before you decide. That information lets you control how big the pot gets and how much you're risking with a hand that might not be as strong as it looks. Checking back a street is a reasonable response. Making a smaller bet is another. Simply folding a marginal holding when the pressure is real is also on the table. Staying in a hand out of stubbornness tends to cost more over time than the occasional fold you didn't need to make. Number 43. Perfecting the art of slow playing. You've got a strong hand. The board is dry. Your opponent likes to bet. This is where slow playing becomes a real option, but only if the conditions actually support it. The first thing to assess is your opponent. Slow playing works best against players who bet when they sense weakness. If they check back when you check, you've given away a free card and built nothing. The tactic depends on them supplying the action you're withholding. Tight or passive players rarely supply that action, so slow playing against them tends to shrink the pot. Board texture matters just as much. A dry flop is one without many straight or flush draw possibilities. It's a safer place to play passively with a strong hand. When the board is coordinated, free cards carry real risk. That player can pick up a draw or complete one. Your strong hand can end up in a worse spot than it needed to be. The safer the board, the more room you have to let opponents catch up. You want them holding a second best hand rather than the best one. Your hand also has to be strong enough to absorb that risk. Near invulnerable holdings like flopped quads are the clearest candidates. Top set on a dry board can work too. Strong hands on connected boards often need protection though. That usually means betting instead of checking. Now the balance side. If you only slow play, observant opponents will notice. They'll see that your checks often mean strength. Then they'll stop betting into you. That undermines the whole purpose of the line. The solution is to fast play strong hands sometimes too. Bet your sets on some boards. Raise your flushes occasionally. When they can't reliably assign hand strength to your passive lines, your slow plays become much harder to read. Pot control is the third element to consider. When you slow play, you're intentionally keeping the pot small early. The plan is to shift to aggression on the turn or river once opponents have put chips in and are more likely to continue. That transition has to be deliberate. If you check the flop and the turn, and then face a small pot on the river, you've likely left value on the table. The passive phase is just the beginning. The pot needs to grow eventually, and you're the one who has to make that happen when the time is right. Number 44. Leveraging showdown value. Some hands don't need to bluff to win. They're strong enough to get to showdown and come out ahead on their own. The question you're asking is whether your hand can beat what the player across from you is likely to hold when the cards go face up. Board texture is the first thing that shapes that answer. On a dry board like King 7-2 with no flush draw and no straight draw, a hand like middle pair tends to have real showdown value. There aren't many draws that beat you, and their range is limited. On a wet board with coordinated cards, that same hand is much more vulnerable. The texture changes what your hand is worth at showdown. Opponent tendencies matter too. Against a player who bets wide and bluffs often, your marginal made hand tends to go up in value. Against a tight player who only bets strong, it tends to go down. You're not just assessing your cards in isolation. You're measuring them against what they are likely to show up with. When your hand does have showdown value, the discipline is in not overplaying it. Bluffing with a hand that can already win is usually a mistake because you're turning a likely winner into a bluff that needs to work. You're giving up the equity you already have. Equity is your share of the pot in the long run. A marginal made hand like weak top pair or middle pair already owns some of that. Betting big to push them off their hand puts that equity at risk. Pot control is how you protect that equity. You check or call on certain streets to keep the pot manageable. The goal is to reach showdown without inflating the risk. It's not passivity out of fear. It's a deliberate choice because your hand doesn't need to win a big pot to be profitable. That said, marginal hands can still extract value. A small bet on the river, somewhere around a quarter to a third of the pot, can pull calls from weaker hands. It can also induce a bluff from a missed draw. You're not trying to build a big pot. The goal is to add a few chips without putting yourself in a spot where a stronger hand punishes you. Number 45. Reading opponent intentions. Bet sizing is one of the clearest windows into what an opponent is trying to do. Most players at lower stakes tend not to randomize their sizings. They develop habits. A small continuation bet on the flop can suggest they're not fully confident in their hand. They're likely trying to see where they stand without committing too much. A large bet, one that's close to or over the size of the pot, tends to indicate either a very strong hand wanting to get paid or a bluff needing you to fold. Medium-strength hands don't usually benefit from that kind of commitment. When you see an overbet, it's worth starting to narrow their range toward those two extremes. The key is building a baseline. Pay attention to how a specific player bets when they're comfortable. Notice what sizing they use at showdown. Once you know their default, any deviation from it becomes meaningful. A passive player who suddenly fires a big bet is often telling you something real. Actions beyond raw sizing carry their own signals. A check raise on the flop often points toward a strong made hand looking to build the pot, or a draw on a coordinated board applying pressure. In either case, they're not trying to keep things small. Slow playing works differently. When someone checks a strong hand on an early street, they're often trying to disguise their strength and pull more money out of you on later streets. Repeated check calling across multiple streets can suggest a medium-strength hand. They may be trying to reach showdown without letting the pot get out of control. Once you've identified a pattern, you adjust. Against a player whose large bets tend to be value-heavy, you can tighten your calling range. Against a player who slow plays frequently, you can apply more pressure on later streets rather than slowing down. Against a player who check calls with medium hands and rarely folds, it makes sense to reduce your bluffs and bet thinner for value. None of this works if you're only paying attention when you're in a hand. The reads you build while sitting out a pot can be the ones that matter most when you're finally involved. Number 46. Executing advanced squeeze plays. When one player opens and another calls before the action reaches you, something useful has happened. Dead money has entered the pot. Both players have shown some interest, but neither has shown real strength. That gap is where the opportunity sits. A squeeze is a pre-flop 3-bet made after a raise and at least one call. The goal is to put enough pressure on both players that they fold. You collect the pot before a flop is ever dealt. The opener has a wide range by definition. The caller, by choosing to flat rather than 3-bet, tends to have a capped range. Premium hands usually 3-bet. When someone just calls, it's reasonable to think they're not sitting on aces or kings. That makes them a weaker obstacle than they might appear. Position matters here. Squeezing from the button or cutoff is generally more favorable because fewer players remain behind you. Every player still to act adds risk. The more players remaining, the more likely one of them holds a hand strong enough to continue. Stack depth matters too. When stacks are around 80 big blinds or deeper, there tends to be more room to maneuver and more fold equity available. Shorter stacks can reduce that room considerably. Sizing is one of the more practical decisions in a squeeze spot. You're not sizing up just for the sake of it. You're building a pot that makes calling with marginal hands uncomfortable. When you'll be out of position after the flop, going larger is often a reasonable adjustment. It puts more pressure on your opponent's pot odds and improves your chances of ending the hand before the flop. The balance between aggression and caution comes down to frequency and target selection. Doing it too often makes you readable. Squeezing too rarely means passing up value that was there for the taking. The best spots tend to share a few features: a loose opener whose range is wide enough to fold often, a passive caller who's unlikely to have a premium, and a position that limits the number of players left to act. Tight opponents are harder to squeeze profitably. Their ranges continue more frequently. The fold equity that makes a squeeze work starts to shrink. When the table has that profile, it's worth pulling back and waiting for a better spot. Number 47. Optimizing bluff frequency. Bluff frequency isn't a fixed setting you dial in once and leave alone. It shifts depending on who you're playing against. It shifts depending on how deep the stacks are. It shifts depending on what the pot odds look like on each street. Start with your opponents. A tight passive player who rarely continues without a strong hand is a better bluff target than a loose aggressive player who calls down wide. Against the first type, you can run bluffs more often because fold equity is real. Against the second type, you'll want to tighten up and lean toward value. Stack depth matters too. Deeper stacks mean more post-flop complexity. That complexity can support more bluffing because the threat of future streets carries weight. At shorter depths, the math tightens, and value hands do more of the work. The sizing you choose also determines how many bluffs your range can support. A pot-sized river bet needs roughly 1 bluff for every 2 value hands to stay balanced. A smaller bet, like 1/3 of the pot, supports fewer bluffs because the caller is getting better odds and doesn't need to fold as often. An overbet shifts that balance and lets you include more bluffs relative to value, since the caller faces worse pot odds. The principle behind this comes from game theory concepts popularized by solvers and theorists like David Sklansky. Your bluff frequency should match the pot odds you're offering. When it does, your opponent can't automatically profit from calling or folding in that spot. That's the core idea behind playing an unexploitable strategy in a given situation. If your range is too value-heavy, sharp opponents will notice. They'll fold their bluff catches against your big bets and call selectively when they have strong hands. You stop getting paid. If you bluff too often, they'll widen their calling ranges and your bluffs stop working. Both imbalances cost you over time. Predictability is the real leak here. Players who continuation bet the flop at a high frequency but rarely follow through on the turn are easy to exploit. Opponents float the flop, then take the pot away when you check. Those who rarely bluff large river bets will often find their bluff catchers folded against them. Most opponents are paying attention more than you might expect. Number 48. Deciphering multi-street bluffs. When you're deciding whether to fire a second or third barrel, the question isn't just whether you have the nerve to do it. It's whether the situation actually supports it. Board texture is the first thing to assess. Some boards favor the aggressor's range across multiple streets. If the turn brings a card that improves what you've been representing, your story gets stronger. If the board runs out in a way that connects well with your perceived range but doesn't help your opponent's likely continuing range, that's a spot worth thinking about. The board has to keep telling the same story across streets, not contradict it. The second piece is your opponent's range. When someone calls a flop bet and reaches the turn with a weak or capped range, they'll often find it harder to continue against more pressure. Opponents who tend to fold to repeated bets on later streets are better candidates for sustained aggression than calling stations who'll pay off regardless. Tracking how often someone folds to continuation bets and river bets can give you a clearer picture of whether sustained aggression is likely to work. Once you've identified a viable spot, bet sizing shapes how the pressure lands. Smaller bets across multiple streets can build pot geometry efficiently. You're keeping the pot at a size where your latest street bet still carries weight. That way you're not committing an unnecessarily large portion of your stack to get there. The goal is to keep your opponent uncertain about whether you're representing strength or just taking a stab. Playing in position helps here. You get to see what your opponent does before deciding whether to keep applying pressure. Stack depth matters too. Deeper stacks preserve the threat of meaningful pressure on later streets. They also raise the cost when a bluff gets called. That's a trade-off you have to account for before you start the line. None of this tends to work consistently if you're only bluffing in these spots. Opponents who face repeated aggression in similar situations will eventually adjust. When your bluffing range includes hands that can also be strong value bets on the same runouts, your opponent won't find it easy to simply call you down every time. The value hands protect the bluffs. The bluffs make the value hands more profitable. That's the structure that keeps multi-street pressure viable over time. Number 49. Understanding opponent's mindset shifts. You don't need to wait for someone to announce they're frustrated. The table tells you before they do. Watch how someone bets when things are going normally. What's their usual sizing on the flop? How quickly do they act in straightforward spots? That baseline is what you're measuring everything else against. A single unusual bet doesn't tell you much. When someone who normally bets small suddenly starts putting in large wagers, that's worth noting. The same is true when someone who usually acts quickly starts tanking in spots that shouldn't be difficult. Deviations from a player's own baseline tend to be more informative than any single action viewed in isolation. Timing shifts are one of the cleaner signals. Hesitation that appears repeatedly in similar spots often points to genuine uncertainty. A player who suddenly speeds up and starts acting without much thought may have stopped processing carefully. Neither of those is a guarantee. When you see the same pattern across several hands, it starts to carry weight. Stack size plays into this too. A player who's running short often feels that pressure. It can push them toward extremes. They might lock up and play too tight. Or they might shove in spots where they'd normally be more measured. Once you've identified a shift, the adjustment depends on which direction the shift went. Against a player showing signs of frustration, widening your value range and applying consistent pressure tends to work well. Frustrated players often call too wide. They tend to make decisions based on emotion rather than the situation in front of them. Against a player who's running well and starting to play overconfidently, the better approach is usually to tighten up and let them do the work. Overconfident players tend to build pots for you. You don't need to force the action. Trapping becomes more effective when someone's eager to put money in. The key is staying flexible. A player who was tilting an hour ago may have settled down. Someone who was cautious early might loosen up after a few wins. Your reads need to update as the session moves forward. Focus on one player at a time before trying to track the whole table. Build a reliable picture of one person, then expand your attention outward. As you do this, remember that understanding others starts with understanding yourself. Your own emotional state matters here. You can't read someone else clearly if you're reacting to your own results. Number 50. Mastering the art of hand reading. Range reading isn't a single moment of insight. It's a process that runs from the first action pre-flop all the way to the river, and each decision your opponent makes either confirms or eliminates parts of what they could be holding. Start with pre-flop. When someone opens from the button in a 6-max game, they're playing somewhere around 40 to 50% of hands depending on their style and the game dynamics. That's a wide range. It includes pocket pairs, suited aces, offsuit aces, suited kings, suited connectors, and more. You're not looking for one specific hand. You're tracking a population of hands that all make sense given the action so far. Then the flop arrives and your opponent does something. Every action narrows that population. A continuation bet on a coordinated board carries different meaning than one on a dry board. A check on a board that connects well with their range is worth noting too. Position matters here. Stack depth matters. And if you've seen this player before, their tendencies matter. You're building a model that updates with each new piece of information. It's not a fixed guess you made pre-flop and never revisited. By the turn, the range has usually tightened considerably. Players who were semi-bluffing draws on the flop have either improved or slowed down. Those who had strong made hands are still betting, or they're setting a trap. A second barrel on a blank turn often represents genuine strength or a committed bluff. Those two possibilities show up at different frequencies depending on the player type you're facing. Bet sizing tells you something about intention. A small bet on a board that should scare the bettor can signal that they want a call but don't have the strength to demand one. It's a reach for value without the hand to back it up. A large bet on a dry board often represents a polarized range. That means either a strong hand or a bluff, with very little in between. Sizing tends not to be random. Most players use sizing to communicate something, even when they don't mean to. Once you've built that picture, you translate it into action. If your read says their range is capped and they can't have the nuts, you can apply pressure. If your read says they're bluffing at a high frequency, you call wider and let them continue. And when your read points to them having it, you find a fold even with a hand that looks strong in isolation. That translation from read to action is where the skill becomes profitable. The observation only matters when it changes what you do.